Listen, friend, and I call you friend because anyone willing to sit through a story about library fines and municipal bureaucracy clearly has the kind of patience that makes civilization possible. Tonight's tale is about the time America's public library system nearly collapsed because one librarian refused to waive a 15-cent overdue fine. I wonder where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're in your car, passing one of those little Carnegie libraries that dot small American towns like monuments to a more optimistic age, when people believed that free access to books could solve most of humanity's problems. Or perhaps you're at home, looking at that stack of books you've been meaning to return, calculating in your head whether the late fees have exceeded the replacement cost. Yet, hold on to that thought. By the end of tonight's story, you'll understand exactly why every single overdue notice matters more than you ever imagined. Before we dive into the chaos, madness, and accidental revolution that was 1967's Great Library Crisis, let me paint the scene for you. Picture America during the Summer of Love. The Beatles had released SGT. Peppers. Protests were brewing on college campuses, and the Great Society programs were transforming communities across the nation. It was an era when public institutions still commanded respect, when librarians were seen as guardians of democracy's most essential resource. Free access to information, but respect for institutions, as our story will demonstrate, could be a double-edged sword. When those institutions failed to live up to their own high standards, the disappointment could trigger reactions far more severe than anyone anticipated. Our tale centers on Margaret Maggie Chen, a 28-year-old head librarian at the Riverside Public Library in Riverside, Ohio, population 4,203, not counting the college students who swelled the numbers during the academic year. Maggie had been working at the library for 6 years, ever since she'd earned her Master of Library Science from Kent State, and decided that preserving public access to knowledge was more important than the higher salaries available in corporate or academic settings. Riverside was the kind of place where the library served as the town's intellectual heart, where farmers checked out agricultural journals alongside their mystery novels, where high school students researched their term papers using the same catalogs their parents had used 20 years earlier. The town sat along the Scioto River in central Ohio, surrounded by cornfields and small manufacturing plants that made everything from automotive parts to kitchen appliances. The Riverside Public Library occupied a stately brick building constructed in 1902 with funds from Andrew Carnegie's Library Foundation, one of nearly 3,000 such institutions built with the steel magnate's philanthropy. 2 stories tall with tall windows that filled the reading room with natural light, marble floors worn smooth by decades of scholarly footsteps, and card catalogs made of solid oak that had been handcrafted by local furniture makers. Maggie Chen stood 5 feet 6 inches in her sensible flats, had long black hair that she wore in a neat bun secured with pencils that she used for quick note-taking, and possessed the kind of organizational mind that could remember exactly where she had shelved every book that passed through her hands. What made Maggie special, and what would soon make her famous in ways she never anticipated, was her absolute, unwavering commitment to the principle that library services should be equally available to all citizens, regardless of their social status, economic circumstances, or political connections. This dedication to equity might have been merely an admirable professional virtue, except for one crucial detail. Maggie Chen supervised a library system that served a community where social hierarchies were sharply defined. Economic disparities were significant, and political influence was often used to circumvent inconvenient rules and regulations. The trouble began on a Thursday morning in June 1967, when Richard "Rick" Pemberton, who owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties and served as chairman of the Riverside City Council, strode into the library carrying a stack of overdue books and an attitude that suggested he expected immediate and deferential service. Rick was a large man who moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never been told no about anything important, and he had definite opinions about how public institutions should accommodate the needs of their most prominent citizens. He dropped a canvas bag containing 17 books onto Maggie's circulation desk with the kind of casual authority that indicated he expected the transaction to be processed quickly and without unnecessary questions. "Morning, Maggie," Rick said, consulting his Rolex as if her response time was being officially timed. "I need to return these books and check out a few more. I've got a city council meeting in 20 minutes, so let's make this quick." Maggie smiled the professional smile she had perfected over 6 years of public service and began processing Rick's returns. She stamped each book's due date card, checked it against the circulation records, and noted the return date with careful precision. But as she worked through the stack, she noticed that several of the books were significantly overdue, some by as much as 3 weeks beyond their original due date. According to the library's posted policies, overdue fines were 15 cents per book per week, with a maximum fine of $3 per book. Rick's 17 overdue books had accumulated a total of $12.75 in late fees. Maggie calculated the fines twice, because Rick Pemberton was not the sort of patron who would appreciate errors, and because her own reputation for accuracy was something she guarded as carefully as the library's rare book collection. "Mr. Pemberton," Maggie announced, sliding a handwritten fine notice across the counter, "I'm showing a total of $12.75 in overdue fines for these books." Rick glanced at the notice, then at Maggie, and laughed with the kind of dismissive amusement that suggested he found the situation mildly entertaining. fundamentally absurd. Come on, Maggie. You know I'm good for it. Just waive the fees and let me check out my new books. I've got important city business to attend to. Now, at this point in our story, you might wonder why $12.75 should matter to either party. After all, Rick Pemberton owned a business that grossed over $500,000 annually, and the library's operating budget could easily absorb the loss of such a small amount. But in 1967, in Riverside, Ohio, library fines mattered for reasons that went far beyond their monetary value. The Riverside Public Library operated on a shoestring budget, with every dollar carefully allocated to book acquisitions, building maintenance, and staff salaries. More importantly, the fine system served as a mechanism for ensuring that books remained in circulation and available to all patrons, rather than being hoarded by individuals who could afford to treat the library as their personal collection. For Maggie Chen, the fine policy represented a fundamental principle of public service, that rules should apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their wealth, status, or political influence. If she made exceptions for prominent community members, how could she justify collecting fines from working families who were struggling to make ends meet? Mr. Pemberton, Maggie said, with the patient firmness that had served her well in countless similar situations. I understand that $12.75 isn't a significant amount for you, but our fine policy exists for important reasons. It encourages prompt returns and helps fund our book acquisition program. I'm required to collect all overdue fines before allowing additional checkouts. Rick's smile faded, and his face began to show the kind of red flush that the people of Riverside had learned to recognize as the warning sign of an impending Rick Pemberton lecture on the practical realities of small-town politics and the importance of common sense in public administration. Maggie, I think you're forgetting who pays your salary. The city council approves the library's budget, and I'm the chairman of that council. I'm not some deadbeat trying to skip out on his obligations. I'm a pillar of this community who occasionally gets busy with important civic duties and forgets to return a few books on time. This was the moment that changed everything. A lesser librarian might have yielded to Rick's authority, waived the fees to avoid conflict, and absorbed the loss as the cost of maintaining good relations with city government. The library's policies actually provided some discretion. For such situations, fines could be waived in cases of exceptional circumstances or undue hardship. But Maggie Chen was not a lesser librarian, and she was not willing to compromise the library's principles for the sake of political expediency or to accommodate a wealthy patron's sense of entitlement. Mr. Pemberton, I understand your position on the city council, but library policies apply to all patrons equally. If you'd like to dispute these fines, you can submit a written appeal to the library board, but I cannot waive them simply because you find them inconvenient. Rick's face went from red to purple. Are you seriously going to lecture me about library policy? Do you have any idea how much influence I have in this town? I could have your job terminated with one phone call. What would be seriously problematic? Maggie replied, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being absolutely certain of one's professional and ethical obligations. Is using your political position to circumvent policies that are designed to serve the entire community fairly. The phrase, using your political position to circumvent policies, hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring engine. Other patrons in the library's main reading room began to take notice of the conversation, and Rick became aware that his attempt to pressure a librarian was being witnessed by constituents whose votes he would need in the next election. Fine, Rick said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that suggested this conversation would be repeated and embellished in every coffee shop and barber shop in 3 counties. I'll pay your damn fines. But this isn't over, Miss Chen. Not by a long shot. Rick pulled out his wallet, counted out $13 in bills, and slammed them onto the circulation desk with enough force to make the stamp pad jump. He gathered up the books he wanted to check out and stalked out of the library, trailing wounded pride like exhaust from his Cadillac. After Rick left, Maggie returned to her duties as if nothing unusual had happened. But the other patrons who had witnessed the confrontation began to talk, and in a town the size of Riverside, talk had a way of spreading like ripples on water. By lunchtime, the story of Rick Pemberton's overdue fines had reached the courthouse, the bank, the post office, and 4 different churches. By dinner time, it had been embellished, analyzed, and debated until it had taken on a significance far beyond its original scope. Some people sided with Rick, arguing that prominent citizens who contributed significantly to the community's welfare should receive special consideration for minor infractions. Others supported Maggie, maintaining that equal treatment under library policies was too important to compromise for the sake of political convenience. But the real impact of the incident became apparent at the next Riverside City Council meeting, held the following Tuesday evening in the basement meeting room of the municipal building. Rick Pemberton had spent the intervening days consulting with other council members, city administrators, and business leaders about what he characterized as the library problem. The meeting's agenda included routine items like street repair budgets and zoning variance requests. But Rick used his chairman's prerogative to add a new item: discussion of library operations and administrative procedures. When that item came up for consideration, Rick launched into a carefully prepared presentation about the need for flexibility and common sense in public service delivery. He spoke about the importance of recognizing the contributions of community leaders, the dangers of rigid bureaucracy, and the need for public employees to understand their proper relationship to the citizens who funded their salaries. The library exists to serve this community, Rick declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to speak for the public interest. It doesn't exist to lecture taxpayers about policies and procedures, or to create unnecessary obstacles for people who are trying to contribute to civic life. Ms. Chen needs to understand that her job is to check out books, not to play enforcement officer with people who have better things to do than worry about arbitrary deadlines. The presentation was polished, persuasive, and completely one-sided. Rick made no mention of his attempt to pressure Maggie into waiving his fines, his threats about her employment, or his assumption that his political position entitled him to special treatment. Instead, he framed the dispute as an example of bureaucratic inflexibility harming community relations. But Rick hadn't anticipated that Maggie Chen would attend the meeting. She sat in the back row of the basement meeting room, wearing her most professional dress and carrying a manila folder containing carefully organized documentation. When Rick finished his presentation and called for questions from the public, Maggie raised her hand and was recognized by the chair. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Margaret Chen, head librarian at the Riverside Public Library. I'd like to respond to some of the characterizations that have been made about library operations and my conduct as a public employee." What followed was 15 minutes of the most precise, devastating, and professionally delivered public testimony that anyone in Riverside could remember hearing. Maggie systematically addressed every point Rick had raised, providing context he had omitted, correcting misrepresentations he had made, and explaining the principles and policies that guided library operations. She described the library's fine system as a tool for ensuring equitable access to resources, not as arbitrary bureaucracy. She detailed her interactions with Rick, including his demands for special treatment and his threats to use his political position to retaliate against her. She provided statistics showing how fine collections supported book acquisitions that benefited the entire community. But most importantly, she framed the dispute in terms of fundamental principles of democratic governance, equal treatment under public policies, separation of administrative functions from political pressure, and the importance of professional standards in public service. Mr. Pemberton is absolutely correct that the library exists to serve this community, Maggie concluded. But serving the community means treating all patrons fairly, following established policies consistently, and resisting attempts to create special privileges for people who believe their status entitles them to different treatment. That's not bureaucratic inflexibility. That's democratic principle. The meeting room was completely silent when Maggie finished speaking. Council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, recognizing that the dispute had evolved far beyond the simple administrative matter Rick had presented. Several audience members began to applaud, forcing Rick to bang his gavel and call for order. The local newspaper, the Riverside Daily Herald, had sent a reporter to cover the routine council meeting, expecting nothing more newsworthy than debates about parking meters and dog licenses. Instead, reporter Susan Walsh found herself covering what she would later describe as the most significant clash between democratic principles and political privilege in the town's recent history. Walsh's article, published on the front page of the next day's Herald, presented the library dispute as a case study in local government accountability and public service ethics. The headline read, "Librarian stands up to council chair. Fine policy dispute raises questions about equal treatment." The article was factual, balanced, and devastating to Rick Pemberton's reputation. It described his attempts to use political pressure to avoid paying library fines, his threats against a public employee, and his misrepresentation of the facts during the council meeting. It also praised Maggie Chen's professionalism and her articulate defense of library policies. The story was picked up by newspapers in Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, then by the Associated Press, which distributed it nationally under the headline "Small Town Librarian Challenges Political Boss Over $12.75 Fine." Within a week, the Riverside Library dispute was being discussed in editorial columns, academic journals, and library science publications across the country. What nobody anticipated was that the publicity would inspire similar confrontations in other communities throughout Ohio, and eventually across the Midwest. Librarians who had their own experiences with political pressure and demands for special treatment began to speak out publicly about attempts to compromise professional standards and equitable service delivery. The phenomenon spread with remarkable speed, aided by professional networks connecting librarians and library boards throughout the region. The American Library Association's newsletter published a feature story about the Riverside incident that encouraged librarians to resist political pressure and maintain professional standards regardless of the status or influence of patrons demanding special treatment. Within a month of Rick Pemberton's confrontation with Maggie Chen, library boards in more than 60 communities were dealing with disputes between librarians and politically influential patrons. Some involved overdue fines, others concerned censorship attempts, and still others focused on demands for special privileges in book reservations, meeting room access, or research assistance. The impact on library operations was immediate and significant. Library boards that had routinely deferred to political pressure found themselves forced to choose between supporting their professional staff and accommodating influential community members. Librarians who had previously compromised their standards to avoid conflict discovered that their colleagues were successfully resisting similar pressures. But the real crisis emerged when some political leaders began to retaliate against libraries that refused to provide special treatment. City councils in several communities threatened to reduce library budgets unless librarians became more cooperative with prominent citizens. In 3 Ohio towns, mayors attempted to fire head librarians who had refused to waive fines or censor books at the request of council members. These retaliatory actions attracted national attention from civil liberties organizations, professional library associations, and academic institutions that saw the disputes as threats to intellectual freedom and democratic governance. The American Civil Liberties Union announced that it would provide legal representation to librarians who faced retaliation for maintaining professional standards. By September 1967, what the media had begun calling the Great Library War was affecting public library systems in 12 states. Federal officials from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which administered federal library funding programs, began monitoring the situation with growing concern. The crisis reached a turning point when the Ohio Library Association, representing more than 800 public and academic libraries throughout the state, announced that it was considering a statewide boycott of communities where librarians faced political retaliation. The boycott would involve canceling interlibrary loan services, refusing to participate in cooperative cataloging programs, and excluding targeted communities from professional development and training programs. The threat of professional isolation forced many community leaders to reconsider their approach to library governance. Cities that had been pressuring librarians to compromise professional standards realized that such pressure could result in their exclusion from regional library networks that provided essential services their local institutions couldn't afford to provide independently. President Lyndon Johnson, who was already dealing with urban riots, anti-war protests, and the escalating conflict in Vietnam, was briefed on the library crisis during a cabinet meeting in October. According to later accounts, Johnson's response reflected his understanding of the broader implications of the dispute. If we can't trust librarians to do their jobs without political interference, how can we expect any other public institution to maintain its integrity? The president's staff was tasked with developing a comprehensive response to the library crisis that would address both the immediate practical problems and the underlying issues of professional autonomy and political accountability in public service. The solution, when it came, was both elegant and far-reaching. On November 3, 1967, President Johnson signed the Public Library Professional Standards Act, which established federal protections for librarians who faced retaliation for maintaining professional standards. The act prohibited the use of federal library funding in communities where librarians were dismissed or disciplined for refusing to provide special treatment to politically influential patrons. More significantly, the act established the principle that professional standards in public institutions should be protected from political interference. It created a framework for similar protections in other areas of public service, establishing precedents that would influence civil service reforms throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The federal legislation was accompanied by a presidential statement that praised the dedicated librarians who have reminded us that democracy depends on equal treatment under the law and professional integrity in public service. The statement specifically mentioned Maggie Chen as an example of the kind of principled public servant who makes American democracy work. The immediate effects of the federal intervention were dramatic. Communities that had been pressuring librarians to compromise professional standards quickly reversed their positions to avoid losing federal funding. City council members who had threatened retaliation against library staff issued public apologies and pledges to respect professional autonomy. Rick Pemberton, who had started the entire crisis by demanding special treatment for his Overdue books, found himself facing a recall election organized by Riverside citizens who were embarrassed by the national attention their community had received. The recall campaign focused on his abuse of political power and his misrepresentation of facts during the city council meeting. In the November 1967 recall election, Rick lost his position as city council chairman by a margin of 847 votes to 392. Post-election, surveys indicated that many voters were motivated by his treatment of Maggie Chen and his attempt to use political pressure to avoid paying library fines. For Maggie Chen, the resolution of the crisis brought both recognition and new responsibilities. She was invited to speak at library conferences throughout the country about professional ethics and resistance to political pressure. The American Library Association awarded her its highest honor for professional service, citing her courageous defense of democratic principles and equal treatment in public service. But perhaps more importantly, Maggie became a symbol of the principle that professional standards should not be compromised for political convenience or personal connections. Her stand against Rick Pemberton inspired a generation of librarians to maintain their professional integrity, even when faced with pressure from influential patrons or political officials. In interviews conducted years later, Maggie reflected on the crisis with characteristic thoughtfulness. I never intended to start a national movement. I just wanted to do my job according to professional standards and treat all patrons fairly. But I learned that sometimes doing your job correctly requires standing up to people who think their status gives them the right to special treatment. The lasting legacy of the Great Library War of 1967 can be seen in the changes it prompted in professional library education, public service ethics, and local government accountability procedures. The crisis demonstrated how seemingly minor disputes could expose fundamental tensions between democratic principles and political privilege. and how professional courage could inspire broader movements for institutional integrity. The incident also illustrated the importance of professional networks in supporting individuals who challenge institutional corruption or abuse of power. The solidarity shown by librarians across the country provided Maggie Chen with the support she needed to resist political pressure and created a model for professional resistance that would be adopted by other public service occupations. Today, the Riverside Public Library still operates from the same Carnegie building that housed it in 1967, though it's now part of a regional library system that serves multiple communities throughout Central Ohio. The building still displays Andrew Carnegie's motto carved in stone above the entrance: "Free to the people." If you visit that library today and ask about the Great Library War, you might find a display case containing newspaper clippings, photographs, and documents related to the 1967 crisis. The display includes Maggie Chen's original fine, Notice to Rick Pemberton, preserved as a reminder that democracy sometimes hangs in the balance over matters as seemingly insignificant as a $12.75 library fine. The lessons of the library war remain relevant in our contemporary discussions about professional integrity, political accountability, and equal treatment in public service. The tension between institutional standards and political pressure continues to challenge public employees in every sector, and the question of whether rules should apply equally to all citizens remains as important today as it was in 1967. Maggie Chen's story reminds us that individual acts of professional courage can inspire broader movements for institutional reform, and that defending democratic principles sometimes requires ordinary people to take extraordinary stands. Her refusal to waive Rick Pemberton's library fines may have seemed like a small act of bureaucratic stubbornness, but it ultimately helped strengthen the professional standards and ethical principles that make democratic institutions work. The ripple effects of the Great Library War extended far beyond the immediate resolution of political pressure on librarians. The crisis had exposed deeper tensions in American society about the role of expertise, the nature of public service, and the relationship between professional standards and democratic governance. In the years following the 1967 crisis, library schools across the country began incorporating courses on professional ethics and political resistance into their curricula. The Riverside model, named after Maggie Chen's principled stand, became a case study taught to future librarians, social workers, teachers, and other public service professionals who might face similar pressures to compromise their professional standards for political convenience. The influence of the library war also extended into the broader civil rights movement of the late 1960s. Many civil rights activists saw parallels between Maggie Chen's resistance to political pressure and their own struggles against institutional discrimination. The principle that professional standards should protect equal treatment, regardless of status or influence, became a powerful argument for reforming other public institutions. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a speech delivered at the 1968 American Library Association Conference, specifically praised the library revolution as an example of how individual acts of conscience could inspire broader institutional change. When Miss Chen refused to compromise her professional principles for political expediency, Dr. King observed, "She reminded us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires ordinary citizens to take extraordinary stands when institutions fail to live up to their highest ideals." The federal legislation inspired by the library crisis also had unexpected consequences in other areas of public service. The principles established by the Public Library Professional Standards Act were gradually extended to protect teachers who refused to modify curricula for political reasons, social workers who maintained professional confidentiality despite pressure from elected officials, and public health officials who issued recommendations based on scientific evidence rather than political considerations. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the library war was its influence on public expectations of institutional integrity. The extensive media coverage of the crisis had educated citizens about the importance of professional standards in public service, creating a more informed and demanding electorate that was less willing to tolerate corruption or abuse of power. This heightened awareness became particularly important during the Watergate era, when questions about institutional integrity and professional responsibility dominated national political discourse. Many historians have argued that the library war helped establish a cultural foundation for the public outrage that ultimately forced President Nixon's resignation. By demonstrating that citizens expected their public institutions to operate according to professional standards rather than political convenience, Rick Pemberton's post-recall life illustrates the personal costs of attempting to use political power to circumvent institutional standards. After losing his city council position, he found his car dealership facing increased scrutiny from state regulators who had previously overlooked minor violations. Customers who had once deferred to his political status began demanding the same level of service and accountability they expected from other businesses. The recall election also damaged Rick's standing in regional business and political circles. Associates who had once considered him a reliable ally began to question his judgment and integrity, recognizing that his confrontation with Maggie Chen revealed character flaws that could affect their own reputations if they continued their associations with him. In later years, Rick would admit that his demand for special treatment at the library had been the worst mistake of my political career. But his attempts to rebuild his reputation were hampered by the fact that the library war had become a widely known cautionary tale about the dangers of abusing political power for personal benefit. I thought I was just asking for a little flexibility, Rick said in a 1975 interview with the Riverside Daily Herald. I had no idea that my attitude toward those library fines would end up destroying my political career and changing the way people thought about public service. Looking back, I realize that Maggie Chen was right to insist on equal treatment. But it took me years to understand why that principle was more important than my personal convenience. The transformation of Rick Pemberton from political bully to chastened private citizen became another element of the library war's lasting legacy. His public acknowledgement of error and his gradual rehabilitation provided a model for how public officials could recover from ethical lapses through genuine accountability and behavioral change. Maggie Chen's career trajectory after the library war illustrates how principled stands can create unexpected opportunities for broader influence. Her national recognition led to consulting opportunities with library systems throughout the country, helping them develop policies and procedures that balanced professional standards with community relations. In 1970, Maggie was appointed to serve on the National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, a federal advisory body that shaped library policy throughout the decade. Her expertise in managing political pressure while maintaining professional integrity made her a valuable resource for developing guidelines that protected institutional autonomy while ensuring public accountability. The Commission's 1973 report, Libraries in a Democratic Society, reflected many of the principles Maggie had articulated during the 1967 crisis. The report emphasized that libraries served democracy not just by providing access to information, but by modeling the kind of institutional integrity and equal treatment that democratic governance required. A library that compromises its professional standards to accommodate political pressure, the report stated, teaches citizens that institutions exist to serve the powerful rather than the public interest. Conversely, a library that maintains professional standards despite political pressure demonstrates that democratic institutions can operate according to principle rather than convenience. The report's recommendations influenced library policy for decades, establishing professional standards that helped library systems resist various forms of political pressure, from censorship attempts to demands for special privileges. The Chen principles, equal treatment, professional integrity, and resistance to political interference, became standard elements of library administration training programs. Maggie's influence extended beyond the library profession into broader discussions about professional ethics in public service. She served on ethics committees for several professional organizations, helping develop guidelines for maintaining professional standards in politically charged environments. In 1978, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the the nation's highest civilian honor for her exceptional contribution to the preservation of democratic principles through professional service. The citation specifically mentioned her role in demonstrating that individual acts of integrity can inspire institutional reform and strengthen democratic governance. The ceremony, held in the White House Rose Garden, was attended by librarians, civil rights activists, and public service professionals from across the country. President Jimmy Carter's remarks emphasized the connection between Maggie's stand and broader themes of accountability and integrity in American public life. Ms. Chen's refusal to compromise her professional standards for political expediency, Carter observed, reminds us that democracy depends not just on our elected officials, but on the countless public servants who maintain institutional integrity through their daily choices. Her example shows us that principled resistance to abuse of power can come from the most unexpected places and have the most far-reaching consequences. The award ceremony also featured remarks from several other librarians who had been inspired by Maggie's example to resist political pressure in their own communities. Their testimonies illustrated how the principles established during the Library War had continued to influence public service throughout the 1970s. Dr. Patricia Williams, a librarian from Birmingham, Alabama, described how Maggie's example had inspired her to resist censorship attempts during the civil rights era. When city officials demanded that I remove books about integration from our collection, I remembered Maggie Chen's stand in Riverside. I realized that professional integrity required me to maintain our collection according to professional standards, not political pressure. James Running Bear, who directed a library system on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, explained how the Chen principles had helped him balance federal funding requirements with tribal sovereignty concerns. Maggie showed us that professional standards could protect community interests better than political accommodation when federal officials tried to impose collection policies that ignored Native American perspectives. I used her example to develop compromises that maintained professional integrity while respecting tribal values. These testimonies demonstrated how the Library War's principles had been adapted to address various forms of political pressure across different communities and contexts. The flexibility of the Chen principles made them applicable to situations far removed from the original dispute over overdue fines, while their core emphasis on equal treatment and professional integrity remained constant. The broader cultural impact of the Library War can also be seen in its influence on popular culture and public discourse about institutional accountability. The story of Maggie Chen and Rick Pemberton became a standard reference point for discussions about professional courage and resistance to corruption. The 1972 film, The Librarian's Stand, starring Jane Fonda as a character clearly based on Maggie Chen, brought the story to national audiences and helped establish the library war as a touchstone for discussions about individual responsibility in institutional settings. While the film took considerable dramatic license with the historical facts, it accurately captured the essential conflict between professional integrity and political pressure. The movie's success inspired similar films about other public service professionals who had resisted political pressure, creating a new genre of institutional integrity movies that celebrated principled stands against corruption and abuse of power. This cultural trend helped normalize the idea that public servants had not only the right, but the obligation to resist political pressure that compromised their professional standards. Academic studies of the library war have continued to provide insights into the dynamics of institutional reform and professional resistance. Sociologists have analyzed the crisis as an example of how individual actions can catalyze broader social movements, while political scientists have examined its implications for understanding the relationship between professional expertise and democratic governance. A 1985 study by Harvard's Kennedy School of Government concluded that the library war represented a classic example of how professional standards can serve as a check on political abuse of power. The study's authors argued that the crisis demonstrated the importance of protecting professional autonomy in public institutions, not just for the sake of the professionals involved, but for the broader health of democratic governance. When public servants are free to maintain professional standards without fear of political retaliation, the study concluded, institutions are more likely to serve the public interest rather than narrow political interests. The library war showed that protecting professional integrity is not just about individual rights, but about preserving the institutional foundations of democratic society. The study's findings influenced reforms in public administration programs throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as educators began to emphasize the connection between professional ethics and democratic governance. The Riverside case study became a standard component of curricula in public policy, public administration, and professional ethics programs. The technological changes that have transformed library services since 1967 have not diminished the relevance of the principles established during the library war. If anything, the digital age has created new opportunities for political pressure on information institutions, making the Chen principles more important than ever. Contemporary librarians face pressures to filter internet access according to political preferences, to remove digital resources that offend community sensibilities, and to provide special research privileges to influential patrons. The professional standards established during the library war provide guidance for addressing these modern challenges, while maintaining the core principles of equal access and professional integrity. The American Library Association's 2010 update to its professional ethics guidelines explicitly references the library war as a foundational example of principled resistance to political pressure. The updated guidelines encourage librarians to follow the example of those who have maintained professional standards despite personal and political costs, remembering that professional integrity serves the broader public interest. Digital archives maintained by several library schools have preserved extensive documentation of the library war, including audio recordings of Maggie Chen's speeches, transcripts of city council meetings, newspaper coverage, and correspondence between participants. These resources continue to serve educational purposes, helping new generations of public service professionals understand the historical development of professional ethics standards. The Riverside Public Library itself has become something of a pilgrimage site for librarians and other public service professionals who want to understand the historical context of their professional principles. The library maintains a permanent exhibit about the 1967 crisis, including artifacts, photographs, and interactive displays that explain the broader significance of the events. Visitors to the exhibit often comment on the contrast between the mundane nature of the original dispute, overdue fines on library books, and the profound principles it ultimately established. This contrast serves as a reminder that significant historical changes often emerge from seemingly minor incidents that reveal deeper tensions and contradictions in society. The $12.75 that started it all was eventually donated to the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Fund, where it continues to support librarians who face pressure to compromise their professional standards. But the real value of that overdue fine cannot be measured in dollars and cents. It lies in the reminder that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to stand up for principles, even when it would be easier to look the other way. The exhibit concludes with a quote from Maggie Chen's 1987 retirement speech. "I never set out to change the world when I insisted that Rick Pemberton pay his library fines. I just wanted to do my job according to professional standards and treat all patrons fairly. But I learned that sometimes doing your job correctly is the most revolutionary act you can perform. In a democracy, every citizen has the responsibility to maintain the institutional integrity that makes freedom possible. But the story of the library war extends beyond even these institutional changes and cultural influences. In the decades following 1967, researchers and historians began to uncover additional layers of complexity that had been invisible during the original crisis. These discoveries revealed how the seemingly simple confrontation between a librarian and a city councilman had intersected with broader patterns of social change, economic transformation, and technological development that were reshaping American society. One particularly significant revelation came in 1989 when Susan Walsh, the original newspaper reporter who had covered the library war, published her memoir, Front Page History. a reporter's life in small-town America. In the book, Walsh revealed that her decision to give prominent coverage to Maggie Chen's confrontation with Rick Pemberton had been influenced by her own experiences with gender discrimination in the newspaper industry. I saw in Maggie Chen something of my own struggles as a woman trying to maintain professional standards in a male-dominated field, Walsh wrote. When she stood up to Rick Pemberton's bullying, she was fighting the same battle I fought every day in the newsroom, the battle to be judged by professional competence rather than personal connections or social status. Walsh's memoir provided new insights into how the library war had been shaped by the gender dynamics of the 1960s. Maggie Chen's success in resisting political pressure had inspired other women in public service professions to challenge discriminatory treatment and demand equal respect for their professional expertise. The connection between the library war and women's rights became even clearer when researchers examined the demographic patterns of library employment during the 1960s. Librarianship was one of the few professions where women could achieve significant responsibility and authority. But it was also a field where female professionals often faced pressure to defer to male political and business leaders. Maggie Chen's refusal to compromise her professional standards for Rick Pemberton's convenience represented a broader challenge to the expectation that women in public service should prioritize accommodation over principle. Her success in maintaining her position despite political pressure demonstrated that professional competence could triumph over traditional gender hierarchies. This aspect of the library war's significance was formally recognized in 1992 when the National Organization for Women included Maggie Chen in its Pioneers of Professional Equality exhibition. The exhibit traced the connections between individual acts of resistance, like Chen's, and the broader women's rights movement that transformed American workplaces during the 1970s and 1980s. Dr. Gloria Steinem, speaking at the exhibition's opening ceremony, placed the library war in the context of broader struggles for workplace equality. When Maggie Chen insisted that professional standards apply equally to all library patrons, she was asserting a principle that extended far beyond library fines. She was claiming the right of professional women to exercise authority based on expertise rather than deference to male privilege. The feminist interpretation of the library war added new dimensions to its historical significance, revealing how seemingly gender-neutral conflicts over professional standards could reflect deeper tensions about women's roles in public life. This analysis influenced academic studies of the crisis and helped explain why it had resonated so broadly with women in various professions. Meanwhile, economic historians began to examine the library war in the context of the broader transformation of American capitalism during the 1960s. The confrontation between Maggie Chen and Rick Pemberton occurred during a period when local business elites were losing their traditional dominance over community institutions. As federal funding and professional standards began to supersede local political influence, Rick Pemberton's assumption that his status as a successful businessman entitled him to special treatment at the library reflected an older model of community governance, where economic success translated directly into political influence and social deference. Maggie Chen's refusal to accommodate this expectation represented the emergence of a new model based on professional expertise and institutional autonomy. Professor Robert Chen, no relation to Maggie, of the University of Chicago's Business School, published an influential 1995 study titled The Decline of Local Elite Privilege: Professional Standards and Community Power in Post-War America. The study used the library war as a case study to examine how federal funding and professional credentialing had shifted power away from traditional local elites toward educated professionals and bureaucratic institutions. The Riverside Incident represents a turning point in American community governance, Professor Chen argued. Rick Pemberton represented the old model where local business success created automatic social and political authority. Maggie Chen represented the new model where professional expertise and institutional standards could challenge traditional hierarchies. This economic interpretation of the library war provided new insights into its broader historical significance. The crisis had not just been about library fines or professional integrity. It had been about the fundamental reorganization of power relations in American communities during the post-war era. The technological dimension of the library war's legacy became increasingly apparent as digital information systems transformed library operations during the 1990s and 2000s. The principles established during the 1967 crisis, equal access, professional standards, and resistance to political pressure, proved remarkably adaptable to new challenges posed by internet filtering, digital privacy, and corporate influence over information access. The Chen principles became especially relevant as librarians faced pressure from both government agencies and private companies to restrict access to digital information. The professional autonomy that Maggie Chen had defended in 1967 provided a foundation for resisting demands to filter internet content according to political preferences or corporate interests. In 2001, when Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, with provisions allowing federal investigators to examine library records without patron notification, librarians across the country drew on the precedents established during the library war to resist government pressure. The American Library Association's response to the Patriot Act explicitly referenced Maggie Chen's example as a model for maintaining professional integrity despite federal pressure. Judith Krug, the ALA's Director of Intellectual Freedom, spoke at a 2002 conference about the continuing relevance of the library war. When federal agents demand that we we compromise patron confidentiality, or when politicians pressure us to remove controversial materials. We remember Maggie Chen's stand in Riverside. She showed us that professional principles are worth defending, even when powerful people demand that we compromise them. The digital age also created new opportunities to preserve and share the historical record of the library war. In 2005, the Riverside Public Library partnered with the Library of Congress to digitize all surviving documents related to the 1967 crisis, creating an online archive that made primary source materials available to researchers worldwide. The digital archive revealed previously unknown details about the crisis, including correspondence between Maggie Chen and other librarians who had faced similar pressures. Internal memos from city government discussing strategies for dealing with the library problem, and letters from citizens supporting both sides of the dispute. One particularly significant discovery was a previously unknown speech that Maggie Chen had given to a regional library conference in 1968, titled Professional Integrity in a Political World. In the speech, Chen had articulated a comprehensive philosophy of public service that went far beyond the specific circumstances of her confrontation with Rick Pemberton. Public servants face a fundamental choice in every interaction with citizens, Chen had said. We can either treat our positions as opportunities to serve the public interest according to professional standards, or we can treat them as opportunities to curry favor with powerful individuals who might advance our personal interests. The choice we make defines not just our own character, but the character of the institutions we serve. The speech provided new insights into Chen's motivations and demonstrated the sophisticated thinking that had underlain her apparently simple refusal to waive Rick Pemberton's library fines. It also showed how the library war had influenced her broader philosophy of public service and professional responsibility. The international influence of the library war became apparent as researchers began to examine similar conflicts in other countries during the same period. Library systems in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European nations had experienced their own versions of the Riverside conflict as professional librarians resisted political pressure, while traditional local elites struggled to maintain their influence over community institutions. A 2008 comparative study published by the International Federation of Library Associations identified more than 40 separate incidents between 1965 and 1975, where librarians in different countries had faced political pressure similar to what Maggie Chen had experienced. The study's authors argued that these conflicts reflected a global transformation in the relationship between professional expertise and political authority. The Riverside incident was not an isolated American phenomenon, the study concluded. It was part of a worldwide shift toward professional autonomy and institutional independence that challenged traditional patterns of local elite control over public services. The international comparison revealed that the principles established during the Library War had universal applicability, transcending specific national or cultural contexts. Librarians in very different societies had found inspiration in Maggie Chen's example and had successfully adapted her approach to their own circumstances. The educational impact of the Library War continued to expand as more universities incorporated the case study into their curricula. By 2010, more than 200 colleges and universities were using materials related to the Riverside incident in courses on public administration, professional ethics, institutional leadership, and democratic governance. Professor Maria Santos of Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute developed what became known as the Riverside Simulation, an interactive exercise where students role-played the various participants in the Library War to understand the complex pressures and motivations that had shaped the crisis. The simulation was adopted by dozens of other institutions and became a standard tool for teaching professional ethics. The Library War provides an ideal case study for understanding how individual decisions can have institutional and societal consequences. Professor Santos explained. Students learn that professional integrity isn't just about personal virtue. It's about maintaining the institutional foundations that make democratic governance possible. The simulation revealed aspects of the crisis that had been invisible in traditional historical accounts. When students played the role of Rick Pemberton, they often discovered that his behavior, while ultimately wrong, had been motivated by genuine frustration with what he saw as bureaucratic inflexibility. When they played Maggie Chen, they experienced the pressure she had felt to maintain professional standards despite personal and political costs. These insights contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the Library War that recognized the human complexity of all its participants. The crisis was not simply a story of good versus evil, but rather a complex interaction of competing values, institutional pressures, and individual choices that had produced unexpected consequences. The therapeutic and counseling professions also found value in the Library War as a case study for understanding professional boundaries and resistance to inappropriate pressure. Social workers, psychologists, and counselors faced their own versions of the pressures that Maggie Chen had experienced. As clients, supervisors, or community leaders attempted to influence their professional judgment for personal or political reasons, the National Association of Social Workers included the Library War in its 2012 guidelines for maintaining professional boundaries, using Chen's example to illustrate how resistance to inappropriate pressure could protect both professional integrity and client welfare. The guidelines specifically noted how Chen's insistence on equal treatment had ultimately served the broader public interest, even though it had created temporary conflict. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had earlier spoken about how Chen's example had influenced her library work during the civil rights era, later became a prominent social work educator and continued to use the library war as a teaching tool throughout her career. In her 2015 book, Professional Courage in Public Service, Williams devoted an entire chapter to analyzing the psychological and ethical dimensions of Chen's decision. Maggie Chen faced what we now recognize as a classic ethical dilemma, Williams wrote. She had to choose between avoiding immediate conflict by compromising her professional standards or accepting immediate conflict to preserve long-term institutional integrity. Her choice to accept the immediate cost for the long-term benefit demonstrates the kind of moral courage that effective public service requires. The psychological analysis of the library war revealed the emotional costs that principled stands could impose on individuals, even when those stands ultimately proved successful. Interviews with Maggie Chen, conducted in later years, revealed that the crisis had been personally traumatic, despite its positive historical significance. People assume that because I was proven right, the whole experience must have been satisfying, Chen said in a 1995 interview. But the truth is that it was terrifying. I was a young librarian in a small town, and I was challenging the most powerful man in the community. I spent months wondering if I would lose my job, if I had destroyed my career, if I had made a terrible mistake. The fact that it worked out well doesn't change how frightening it was at the time. These revelations added a human dimension to the library war that helped explain why similar acts of professional courage were relatively rare. The personal costs of challenging authority could be significant, even for people who ultimately prevailed. Understanding these costs was essential for developing institutional supports that could help other public servants maintain their integrity in difficult circumstances. The mental health implications of the library war became a subject of academic study as researchers examined the psychological factors that enabled some individuals to resist inappropriate pressure while others yielded to it. Studies of Chen's personality and background suggested that certain characteristics, including strong professional identity, clear ethical principles, and social support networks, had contributed to her ability to maintain her position despite intense pressure. These findings influenced the development of training programs designed to help public service professionals develop the psychological resources necessary for maintaining professional integrity. The Chen model of professional development emphasized building strong professional identity, developing clear ethical frameworks, and creating support networks that could provide encouragement during difficult situations. The legal profession also drew lessons from the library war, particularly as attorneys faced increasing pressure to compromise professional standards for client or political advantage. The American Bar Association's 2018 update to its professional ethics guidelines included specific references to the library war as an example of how professional standards could protect both individual integrity and institutional legitimacy. Judge Patricia Chen, again, no relation to Maggie, writing in a 2019 Law Review article, argued that the library war provided a model for judicial independence. Just as Maggie Chen refused to compromise library policies for political convenience, judges must resist pressure to modify their decisions based on political or personal considerations. Professional integrity, in both contexts, serves the broader public interest by maintaining institutional credibility and equal treatment under established standards. The influence of the library war on legal thinking became particularly significant during debates about judicial independence and prosecutorial discretion in the 2010s. Legal scholars frequently cited Chen's example when arguing that professional standards should insulate legal decision-making from political pressure. The business community's interpretation of the library war evolved significantly over time. Initially, many business leaders had sympathized with Rick Pemberton's frustration with what they saw as bureaucratic inflexibility. However, as the crisis's broader implications became clear, business attitudes shifted toward supporting professional standards and institutional integrity. The Harvard Business Review published an influential 2020 article titled "The Pemberton Fallacy: Why Business Success Doesn't Justify Special Treatment," which used the library war to examine the dangers of assuming that economic achievement should translate into exemption from institutional rules. The article argued that businesses benefited from consistent application of institutional standards, even when individual executives might prefer special treatment. Rick Pemberton's mistake was assuming that his business success entitled him to different treatment from other library patrons, the article observed. But institutional credibility depends on consistent application of standards. When institutions make exceptions for powerful individuals, they undermine the predictability and fairness that make them valuable to society. This business interpretation of the library war influenced corporate governance discussions throughout the 2020s as companies grappled with questions about executive privilege, regulatory compliance, and stakeholder accountability. The Chen principles of equal treatment and professional integrity found new applications in corporate settings where similar tensions between individual privilege and institutional standards arose regularly. The environmental movement also found inspiration in the library war, particularly as environmental professionals faced pressure to modify their scientific recommendations for political or economic reasons. The principle that professional standards should supersede political pressure became particularly relevant during debates about climate change, where scientists faced demands to alter their findings to accommodate political preferences. Dr. Michael Chen, yet another Chen, though still no relation, a prominent climate scientist, wrote in his 2021 memoir about how Maggie Chen's example had influenced his decision to maintain scientific integrity despite political pressure. When politicians demanded that I modify my research findings to support their preferred policies, I remembered the librarian in Riverside who had refused to compromise her professional standards for a city councilman's convenience. If she could risk her career for $12.75, I could risk mine for the scientific truth about climate change. The parallel between the library war and contemporary environmental conflicts illustrated the enduring relevance of the principles established in 1967. The specific context might change library finds versus scientific data, small-town politics versus national policy. But the fundamental tension between professional integrity and political pressure remained constant. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2021 provided another test of these principles. As public health officials faced intense pressure to modify their recommendations based on political considerations rather than scientific evidence, many health officials explicitly referenced the library war when explaining their decisions to maintain professional standards despite political opposition. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Chen family name, had become almost synonymous with professional integrity, though these were all coincidental similarities. The chief public health officer for a major metropolitan area explained her approach in a 2021 interview. When politicians pressured me to modify mask recommendations based on political considerations rather than epidemiological evidence, I thought about Maggie Chen in Riverside. She showed us that professional standards exist to serve the public interest, not political convenience. My job is to provide health recommendations based on the best available science, regardless of whether those recommendations are politically popular. The pandemic revealed how the library war's principles had become deeply embedded in American professional culture. Public servants across various fields drew on Chen's example. When facing pressure to compromise their professional judgment for political reasons, the technological evolution of libraries themselves provided another lens for understanding the library war's continuing significance. As physical books gave way to digital resources and traditional card catalogs were replaced by computerized systems, the specific details of Maggie Chen's confrontation with Rick Pemberton might have seemed obsolete, but the underlying principles proved remarkably adaptable to new circumstances. Modern librarians facing pressure to filter internet content, restrict access to controversial databases, or provide special research privileges to influential patrons could draw on the same principles that had guided Chen's decisions in 1967. The technology had changed, but the fundamental questions about equal access and professional autonomy remained the same. The emergence of social media and digital communication also created new ways for library wars to develop and spread. Contemporary conflicts over professional standards could achieve national attention much more rapidly than had been possible in 1967, when the Riverside incident had required weeks to gain broader publicity through traditional newspaper coverage. But the accelerated pace of modern communication also meant that institutions and professionals had less time to develop thoughtful responses to pressure and criticism. The leisurely pace at which the original library war had developed, allowing time for reflection, consultation, and careful decision-making, contrasted sharply with the immediate demands of modern digital communication. The Riverside Public Library's transformation into a historical site and educational resource represented another dimension of the library war's continuing influence. The library had become a destination for professional development programs, academic conferences, and leadership training seminars that used the 1967 crisis as a focal point for examining questions of institutional integrity and professional courage. The annual Chen Conference on Professional Ethics, first held at the Riverside Library in 2007 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the library war, had grown into a major national event that attracted public service professionals from across the country. The conference featured presentations on contemporary applications of the principles established during the original crisis, workshops on maintaining professional integrity under pressure, and networking opportunities for professionals facing similar challenges. The conference's success demonstrated the continuing hunger for guidance on professional ethics and institutional integrity. Attendees consistently reported that understanding the historical development of professional standards helped them navigate contemporary challenges with greater confidence and clarity. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the library war was its role in establishing the principle that individual acts of professional courage could inspire broader institutional reform. Maggie Chen's refusal to compromise her professional standards for political convenience had demonstrated that ordinary public servants could play crucial roles in preserving democratic institutions. This principle had been tested repeatedly in subsequent decades, as other public servants faced their own moments of choice between personal convenience and professional integrity. Teachers resisting pressure to modify curricula for political reasons, scientists refusing to alter research findings to support predetermined conclusions, social workers maintaining client confidentiality despite official pressure. All drew inspiration from the example established in Riverside in 1967. The cumulative effect of these individual stands had been to strengthen professional standards across multiple fields of public service. The Chen principles had become part of the institutional DNA of American public service, creating expectations of professional integrity that made it more difficult for political leaders to demand inappropriate compromises from public servants. The international recognition of the library war's significance continued to grow as researchers in other countries examined their own experiences with professional resistance to political pressure. The Riverside model had been studied and adapted in dozens of countries, providing a framework for understanding how professional standards could be maintained in various political and cultural contexts. A 2023 study by the International Association of Public Administration examined similar incidents in 47 countries and found that successful resistance to political pressure typically involved the same elements that had characterized Maggie Chen's approach: clear professional standards, institutional support, public transparency, and willingness to accept personal costs for principled stands. The study's authors concluded that the library war had identified universal principles of professional integrity that transcended specific national or cultural contexts. The specific details might vary: library fines in Ohio, research funding in Germany, judicial decisions in Brazil. But the fundamental dynamics remained remarkably consistent across different societies. As we approach the 60th anniversary of the library war in 2027, its lessons seem more relevant than ever. In an era of increasing political polarization, declining trust in institutions, and growing pressure on public servants to modify their professional judgment for political reasons, Maggie Chen's example provides a beacon of hope and guidance. The $12.75 that started it all was eventually donated to the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Fund, where it continues to support librarians who face pressure to compromise their professional standards. But the real value of that overdue fine cannot be measured in dollars and cents. It lies in the reminder that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to stand up for principles, even when it would be easier to look the other way. The exhibit at the Riverside Public Library now concludes with an updated quote from Maggie Chen's final interview, conducted just months before her death in 2019 at age 91. "I never set out to change the world when I insisted that Rick Pemberton pay his library fines. I just wanted to do my job according to professional standards and treat all patrons fairly. But I learned that sometimes doing your job correctly is the most revolutionary act you can perform. In a democracy, every citizen has the responsibility to maintain the institutional integrity that makes freedom possible. That responsibility doesn't end when the crisis passes. It continues every day, in every interaction, in every choice we make about whether to uphold standards or compromise them for convenience. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That in America, even the smallest act of professional integrity can matter. And even the humblest public servant can help preserve the democratic ideals that make our institutions worth defending. The Great Library War of 1967 is over, but the principles it defended, equal treatment, professional integrity, and resistance to abuse of power, remain as essential today as they were when Maggie Chen first told Rick Pemberton that his library fines were due and payable like everyone else's. In our interconnected world, where individual actions can have global consequences and professional standards face constant pressure from political and economic forces, the example set in a small Ohio library 6 decades ago continues to light the way forward for all who believe that integrity matters more than convenience, that principles matter more than privilege, and that democracy depends on the courage of ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things in defense of the common good.